President of Trinity College's Students' Union, and I'm going to talk a little bit about, I suppose, my career and my education and what has got me here to date, and hopefully just some bits in there that might help people in terms of what they want to do. But I'm going to start with a story about Richard Branson and say, what a wanker. Right? I met Richard Branson a month ago, 2 months ago, around the legalisation and decriminalisation of drugs. And I asked a very unpopular question that people don't like me asking. What happens to the drug dealers? They'll have no job. And I put my hand up and I asked Richard Branson, I said, it's all well and good with decriminalisation, but when you move to legalisation and you completely take the trade, I says there's an underlying problem of inequality and poverty in working class areas that leads to drug dealing in the first place. And what do we do to approach that? So we just have a bunch of criminals that we've taken their jobs away from them. Do you think then they just aren't criminals anymore? And how do we actually begin to change their lives or put money and invest it in them so that they have other options or that they can return to education? And how do we address that? And he said, well, when I lost Virgin, the music store label, I just done something else. And I looked to say, well, how is that a comparison? Like, that was a legit job. It was a music store. Like, it's nothing like being impoverished in a working class area and having no prospects. But anyway, so I just thought I'd tell you that. I'm glad you didn't get through to him, Brian, wherever you're gone. So at about 15, I dropped out of school. I didn't really enjoy school, not because I wasn't good at it, because I didn't like being told what to do. I would often be labelled as disruptive. I suppose my first experience of being labelled, and labels are something that continues throughout my career and my journey. But one of the labels that I had was disruptive. And disruptive was basically because I would ask questions a lot. And God forbid you ask a teacher a question that's not on the page or a book in front of her, and they haven't learned to think beyond the curriculum in some cases. So just because I would challenge and ask questions, and questions that I thought were very legit to what we were learning, but they didn't, because like I said, it wasn't on the page in front of her. So I struggled with that then, because I felt I couldn't. I learned by participating in conversation, not by just listening to somebody at the top of a room. And so I struggled, and I went on to struggle through that. Some of the other things I struggled with was being a girl, and being excluded from football. I didn't really have any interest in the church, but I decided because there was no female altar girls, I was going to have a protest there. And before I knew it, I was in the gown and acolytes in my hand and up to, and we changed that and we got female altar girls. And then I left because it was changed, I didn't need to do it anymore. And that kind of thing continued throughout my life. So rather than being put down and being excluded, I said, I need to find solutions. I need to find how I can change this thing that I'm being excluded from, and how I can share that then with everybody else that's been excluded from it. And I didn't realise that was a reoccurring theme throughout my life until I got to a certain age and I looked back retrospectively and start to see all those patterns. School trousers was another thing, freezing cold, girls' knees rattling in the skirts, and I'm looking at the lads and their trousers, not a bother on them, and I'm going, that's really unfair, like I'm freezing. And again, protest school trousers. So we still wear school trousers now in Killinarden schools because we caused a fuss and said it was really unfair that girls had to be cold just because they were assumed they had to wear a skirt. So that just continued on throughout my life. And when I was about 15, sitting my junior cert, 8 months pregnant, and thinking, what the hell, how am I going to do this now? I do want an education, maybe just not a mainstream education, and I do have prospects, and I had a really amazing mother and father. So as soon as I became pregnant, I mean, before that I was robbing cars and doing drugs, but we'll forget about that small little period there. But I had an amazing mother, and I said, I'm pregnant now, and I know what it's like to have a good mother, and something has to change here. So I just drastically turned around my life overnight, and everything unhealthy that I was doing. Now, to keep in mind, the unhealthy things I was doing was very much an escape. I witnessed a friend be hit by a bus when I was 12, and she died in front of us. And it was at that period of time that I just began to really lash out, and the schools didn't really know how to respond to that. There was 7 of us there, and nobody intervened and thought, Jesus, this is a very traumatic experience for young people to go through. They just left us. They didn't provide counselling. They didn't, and I would have thought, looking back, I did have post-traumatic stress. I would have flashbacks, and so drugs and all them things became an escape out of the trauma that I was feeling inside. So when I became a mother, I went to Aunt Kassan in Tala. And it was great because I could bring Jordan with me. She could go to the creche there while I got an education. It wasn't so much about the education at the time, but it was a very holistic approach to education. And as a child that was carrying a lot of trauma, it really suited me. The environment, you sat in circles, you meditated before you started your class. And that's what I was responding to, this different way of learning. After that, I decided that a lot of my friends had then moved on to heroin, and things were getting a lot worse for us in the area. And I decided I was going to, I realised at about 14, I remember sitting in the library with heroin in my hand and going, will I? And I sat on a computer and I taught myself everything you could imagine I could learn in a couple of days about heroin, about addiction, about methadone. And I realised my brain had this capacity to really take in information on things that I cared about. If there was people around me that were affected by it, I could suck it in straight away because I knew something had to change and something had to be done. So my education was being really driven by me emotions and me drive to change things for the people around me. So I decided that I wanted to study addiction studies, but everywhere told me I was too young and had no life experience. And I'm looking, going, and this would be a priest, and I've just lived a very hectic life, and I'm going, I'm pretty sure I've plenty of life experience if you just listen to it. And he wouldn't let me on the course. And it was in IT Tala, and I told him I'm going to show up anyway. And that's another reoccurring theme. I've an inability to be told no. And I said, I'm going to show up anyway. I said, so whether you choose to acknowledge me in the room or not is a different story, but I'll be there. And that'll get pretty awkward if you're going to pretend I'm not there. And they changed the whole policy, and they allowed me in. I was 17, and you had to be 23, and they changed it. At the end of that course, the lecturer, and he was a priest, and he developed the CARP Killinarden, which is Community Addiction Response Programme. And at the age of 18 when I finished that course, he came to me and he said, I am sorry, I'm so glad you refused to be told no. Can I give you a job? I would like you to develop addiction programs for young heroin users in Tala. And I did. And I realised when I got older, I did it very successfully. I was hard working, I was creative. I didn't kind of box myself into the stuff you learn in a classroom. I tried to look at alternative ways to engage young people. Again, rob cars was a big thing in my time, so I was like, let's buy a battered up car and get the young men in to do it up, and that's a great way to engage with young men. We can all talk while we're doing this activity. And I kind of carried that ethos throughout my career. I developed an amazing service in Bluebell, and it was very, very hard for me to leave. In that service, I didn't like the way addiction programs were becoming like businesses. And I thought everyone was a number, and every person that came through the door represented another piece of funding, and that just didn't sit right with me. Instead of seeing them as them coming in the door with an addiction, it was like, now we need to fill out and hire these statistics when we apply for more funding, because that means we should get more because there's more people through the door. And I just thought it really dehumanised exactly what work we were doing. So I developed a programme with women that had been years on methadone, some of them up to 10, 15 years. And we called it Filling a Gap at BAG. BAG was the name, great name, isn't it? BAG for a drugs programme. But anyway, Bluebell Addiction Advisory Group, and it was BAG for short. And we called it Filling a Gap at BAG. And it was around filling the gaps in women's lives that addiction used to fill. So sourcing drugs, sourcing the money, going and buying the drugs, setting up the paraphernalia. So when you remove that, that's an awful lot. That's a big void in someone's life that they just spend doing all them activities. So it's like, how do we replace that? And we got a Michelin star chef in, and for months, and we taught them how to cook these amazing dishes, and we published a cookbook, and it was all around healing yourself after addiction. So the recipes were designed around your liver, your hair, your metabolism. Methadone slows your metabolism right down, so the women were uncomfortable with their bodies because they began to bloat because of this. So we designed all the menu around addressing these things, and I just thought it was amazing, and I said, let's bring it on tour. Let's bring this cookbook on tour. So we went around and we cooked meals for people all over the canal communities, local drugs task force areas. Then they began to be employed. People were so impressed. The task forces, the drugs groups, the South Dublin County Council began to employ these women to do running buffets at different events. And the more that happened, miraculously or not miraculously, we didn't talk about drugs anymore. We didn't talk about triggers. We didn't talk about the usual stuff that you do in addiction programs. We just talked about positive things, creating change, getting an education, gaining new skills. And the more they had that, the less drugs they used, and many of them moved after 10 years on methadone. 3 of them women out of 10 became methadone free. And other services couldn't understand what I was doing, and they try and make me justify it all the time. And I'm like, I don't need to look at the results, but because it didn't fit into their addiction model, it was like, oh, what's she doing up there? All this hippie stuff or something, I don't know. And so then the women were being hired. But then I had a men's group that done the gardening and grew vegetables. And I was like, social economy, let's do that. Women now, tell the men what you need grown in the garden. You buy the produce off them. They grow it, and then it just built from there. So the women were getting jobs, telling the men that they needed potatoes, carrots, da-da-da-da-da. The men would have a main, and they would buy it between them, and it just created a small little social economy in Bluebell, like. And nobody could appreciate how amazing this was apart from me, you know. And I'm looking and I'm screaming at the government, and I'm going, look, this is absolutely amazing what's going on here. But they kept cutting us and cutting us and cutting us and cutting us. And that's when I realised I was getting angry. So I was coursing at them, and I wasn't articulating myself very well, and it was all done on passion and want, and I'm like, how the hell am I going to communicate to the government the amazing stuff that's happening on the ground here? I had to walk away from Bluebell, and that killed me. But I had to walk away so that I could go to Trinity and get an education, so I could finally articulate the amazing work that happens on a community level, and be able to articulate it at this level, and because I realised I hadn't got a language. The people in power had a monopoly over the language that they use, and they used it to lock me out of the bee. And I needed to get that language, and I needed to be able to communicate that story of the people on the ground. And that's what brought me to Trinity. And then I ran for president. Some people urged me to do it because I wouldn't be your usual SU kind of hack, but I just came in, and I'm sure the poor young men that were running for it was like, I can't believe some L1 from Tallaght is after coming in and taking that off. I was like, and so I tried to use that platform there to really drive home quality of education and just how powerful education is. Like, I have 2 daughters, and education is so important to them. They live in Trinity with me. You know, they go to Phil debates, and they ask questions to Baz Luhrmann and world-renowned philosophers, and they're 9 and 15, you know, and that's only because I've exposed them. They're still from Tallaght. They still go to Tallaght schools, but I've given them a pathway that so many people don't have that pathway. So that's why, you know, my career, and I think the rest of my life, will be spent trying to clear those pathways, those cultural pathways, and the cultural blocks and the financial blocks for people accessing education. Because when I look at addiction, which I've worked in for a long, long time, when I look at homelessness, which I've worked in for a long, long time, mental health, long, long time, education can affect change in all those areas. So rather than me isolating myself to one particular area like homelessness or like addiction, I would like to try and pursue, if we can have a more equal society that gives equal access to education, well, then we can affect change in all those areas. Like, it costs us $100,000 a year to house a prisoner, and some of them are in there for ridiculous stuff. Imagine taking that $100,000 and investing it in that young person while they were in school or while they were in the community. That's where that should be, not as a symptom of things that have already happened, but put it in terms of prevention. So that's where I'm at now. I've decided that obviously a year is a very short space of time in TCD, and sometimes they look at me going, she's off talking for prisoners and this and that. She's supposed to be the student union president. What's she doing? But they've been very good. They've allowed me use my position, and they don't have to, because they could say, you're mandated to represent us, and you seem to be trying to represent anyone but us. But that's not the case, you know. I think we have an activist festival this Saturday, if anyone wants to come along. It took months for me to organise. I have the first Icelandic Prime Minister, female Prime Minister, an openly gay Prime Minister as a keynote speaker. I have Hosier closing the event. I have Rory McQuernan, the Secretary to State, doing a session. I have Theo Dorgan, the poet and academic, doing Language and Power. I have Kathleen Lynch from here in UCD, doing the commodification of education. There's an amazing timetable. You can see it on my Twitter. Everyone's welcome. It's not only for Trinity students. Again, I know I will keep opening things up to everyone. But anyway, so it's not only for Trinity students, and there's some young people going to come along, activists, academics, and it's around bridging the gap between activists and academics to be able to turn theory into action, because I feel students are at their most idealistic when they start out in college, and sometimes that can be bet out of them before they actually finish college. So I want to try and harness that, and so you're all very welcome to come along to that. I've also decided to run for the Seanad on the TCD panel, mostly because it's the most undemocratic, unrepresentative position you can hold in office, and I thought if I could just kind of smash the usual people that kind of get into them positions, it'd be very hard to do. But I think if I had another 5 years where I had a platform, I could continue to try and push forward the programs that I want to see. One of them, which is to train primary school teachers for an extra year if they're going to be working specifically in DEIS schools. So it would be to train them mental health, addiction, around poverty. So it's like this extra piece of training so they can really wrap supports around young people that are living in areas of disadvantage. So I need obviously the platform to be able to really do that I'm not just kind of walking against the wind if I'm on the ground. So that's where I'm at now, and thank you.